welcome to another Coffee and Hardtack with the Civil War Museum in Kenosha, Wisconsin. My name is Jenn Edginton, and I'm Curator of Social Studies Education here at the Civil War Museum. And with me, as always, is Doug Dammann, Manager of the Education Department and Curator of the Civil War Museum. And we're really excited for our guests today for Coffee and Hardtack. So I'm going to turn it over to Niels Eichhorn. So thank you so much for coming. And can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, thank you for having me. Great pleasure to be along for this, especially since you're doing the exhibit on immigration and the Civil War. Well, to keep it kind of short and light, my interest in the Civil War started in kind of the late 90s when the videotape gave out as Pickett's Charge was taking off in the movie Gettysburg. And I kind of was like, how do I figure out what actually happened? And being German, it was a hard time finding books. And well, that has accumulated quite extensively in my background over the years now. But when I started my undergrad, I kind of was like, what can I write my paper on for the Civil War class? And the professor was like, well, what about Germans or Germany at the time? And I was like, oh, well, let's look. And when I discovered how little was written, I kind of was like, okay, let's go with that and do some diplomacy. I will eventually get back to it, I promise. But it's sort of like the dissertation that then morphed into Liberty and Slavery, the second book on Atlantic history, now kind of a book on Macon that I have forthcoming, a book on Latin America. They all sort of got into the way of going back to diplomacy, but I will get back to it at some point and be able to talk about the German-US relations during the Civil War era in some form.
So you're staying busy, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, helps keep the mind occupied, you know. And I just enjoy it too. I really going through Latin American records right now. It's like I have learned so much about places in Argentina and Peru that I never even imagined existed. So it's sort of like it's really fun to see.
Absolutely.
Niels, you did mention that we are opening an exhibit on immigrant soldiers who served in the Union Army, and it composed about 25% of the entire Union Army were immigrants from foreign countries. And here in Wisconsin, we certainly have a large number of German immigrants from the Milwaukee area who ended up serving. You mentioned your dissertation and your early research. Can you talk to us a little bit about that diplomatic relationship between Germany and the federal government, the Lincoln administration, during the Civil War?
Sure. It's a very complex situation because Germany per se doesn't exist yet. We're still in the stage of 36 independent entities at this time. And the main ones obviously are Austria and Prussia. That's your two big ones, and they will go to war in 64, 66, and then 71 was the Germany really coming into existence, the German Empire. At the time of the American Civil War, you actually had 3 diplomatic representatives in the United States from German states, which being Baron von Geroldt, who is the Prussian, and for the German states, the other important one is Rudolf Matthias Schleiden, who is from Bremen. And he was the one that actually got me really interested in it, because Schleiden in 1861 in April goes to Richmond and sees Alexander Stephens, the Confederate vice president. And he tries to kind of figure out maybe there's a possibility to work out some form of an agreement, a truce for a while, let Congress come together on July 4th and kind of special session that is, and maybe they can figure it out short of war, how to solve their issues. So you do have this kind of brief moment of interaction there diplomatically, but beyond that, the relationships are very commercial. That it's sort of like, how do you encourage trade into different regions in the United States? How can Germany overcome some of this shortage of cotton coming to Central Europe? And then the interesting part too is that you have these diplomatic representatives, but you also have the consular representation, and they're very conflated these days, where if you go states, foreign service in the United States, you most likely end up first service in a consulate, and then you kind of work yourself up. Consulates in the 1860s were actually more economic representations, that they were encouraging trade. And so you do have all these consulates that are trade encouraging, but the German ones are often also placed in areas where you have a large German population. So Chicago would have had something. I think Milwaukee had one or two, actually. You have some in Detroit, St. Louis, Cincinnati. So they're also about maintaining a relationship with the home country. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, the very basic of kind of the diplomatic interactions. It's very commercial, but it's also sometimes about this maintaining these national ties between mother country and the immigrant community in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. And I know that you've worked on multiple articles about kind of the European elements in the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
And so additional to that, you wrote an article about Queen Victoria's speech to Parliament, where she really is looking at, she announces Britain's neutrality for the American Civil War. So how did that affect the North? How did it affect the South? Why did she make that decision? Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
And keep it short and simple.
Yeah, right.
Because there's whole books, and it's still somewhat confusing at times, because it let me put it this way: international law, you would think, is somewhat simple in the 1860s, but it's extremely convoluted and difficult, unfortunately. So let me take a step back before Queen Victoria's speech, actually, because the point of importance there is, when the war breaks out at Fort Sumter in April '61, it's like, okay, it's a domestic incident between North and South. So a couple of southern states have rebelled, and they'll figure something out. I mean, we're still under the assumption 6 months and it's over, potentially. But when you have, and it's not even Lincoln calling for volunteers, it is when Lincoln says, we're going to blockade southern ports. And very important, blockades the ports. We're not blockading the coastline. And Jefferson Davis, I think it's a day earlier, announced that the Confederacy was issuing letters of marque and reprisal, which is privateering, allowing Confederates who hold these letters to prey on U.S. merchant ships, kind of this legalized piracy. So kind of Jack Sparrow allowed. When that happens for Great Britain, it's sort of like, oops, now it's not a domestic conflict anymore. Lincoln, I mean, for all intents and purposes, Lincoln screwed up big time when he issued the blockade proclamation, because you do not blockade your own country. And he claims that the southern states were in a rebellion, so it's still U.S. territory, technically speaking. The blockade is really, it's a disaster in that regard, because internationally now, the international community says, well, this is two sides fighting each other. It's a war. And that, taking the war into international waters, really required Britain to say, we need to protect our interests. So this is kind of, it's selfish, but that's really what it is. The neutrality proclamation on Great Britain's part is selfishly saying, we're staying out. Now, there's two other aspects to this, though. They're saying we're staying out, and they're also invoking a British law, I forget what it's actually called right now, that basically says British subjects cannot get involved either. If you decide to pick up the arm for the US, that's your deal. I mean, do what you want, but don't expect us to come to your rescue. If a British subjects does Confederate privateering and gets captured by the US and gets tried as a pirate and executed, Britain will not protect you. So this was sort of like, we're not supplying weapons to you, we're not going to help you in any shape or form, But sort of the complicating factor in this was that Britain also decided that within the declaration was acknowledging that both the United States and the Confederate States were powers at war, which meant under international law, both sides had certain privileges granted to them. One, for example, is that a ship can go into a port for, I want to say, 24 hours. And unless they need to refit, have major damage due to kind of weather phenomenon, they'll have to leave after 24 hours. If they need to refit, they can stay longer, obviously. But it sort of kept, it put a stop to, you can't use a British port for any purposes, but it applied to both sides. So from the US perspective, this sort of was, oh, Britain is about to recognize the Confederacy as an international member of the international community. And that's where the Lincoln administration very much was concerned about this could have dramatic consequences. Thankfully, that never took place, but that sort of, the entire Neutrality Proclamation became the linchpin around which a lot of the diplomatic crises of the Civil War then kind of revolved.
Wow. That was, you took such a big answer and made it very succinct, so thank you.
It took a while to figure it out.
The debates about the American Civil War not only played out on the official levels, the diplomatic levels of the two countries, but also in the public arenas as well, in newspapers. Mm-hmm. There were debates between Cassius Clay and Edward de Leon about their views of slavery and its role in the war. Could you talk about those letters and why they would be published and why they were so important and such great reading material for the public in London, and why would a newspaper expend so much of its surface area on that debate?
That's a really good and multi-leveled question there. Question, Doug. Let me answer this in a couple stages. Because one part is that the European newspapers extensively covered what happened in the United States. A handful have actually correspondents in the US. William Howard Russell is a very famous one. He kind of pioneered war correspondency during the Crimean War, and he comes to the US during the Civil War for a little while and does the same thing. One or two German newspapers have a correspondent in the US as well. But you do get a lot of coverage. Political, there's usually like the big military events get covered, new laws, especially pertaining to immigrant communities get covered. So the United States is well covered in European newspapers. It's surprising that I went through the Hamburger Nachrichten one time, and it's like almost every day there was a short piece that they printed from like a British paper or US paper that kind of pertain to events in the Civil War. So it's fascinating. Now, that being said, this sort of goes to the problem of what is the war about? I mean, the Southern states very clearly stated in their secession declarations this is about slavery, and because we want to be independent. Lincoln kind of says this is about union in his inaugural address. So from a European perspective, it's like, so what is this war actually about? Is it about union, which means you are kind of trying to tell a group of states to follow your line of thinking, not their line of thinking, which sounds very much like empire? Or is it about freedom, self-determination, to use Woodrow Wilson's terminology? Which we kind of liked when the Hungarians did it, the Poles do it. We don't support them, but we kind of like it. So it's kind of, there's a lot of uncertainty in April, May, June of 1861 of like, what is this about? Why are you guys fighting? And this is really where Clay, DeLeon, and even John Lothrop Motley step into the picture and kind of like, okay, the Brits have no clue what this war is about. We need to step in here and kind of explain this. And Cassius Clay is on his way to St. Petersburg at the time as the US representatives there. Motley is just, he's well known in Europe. He studied at the universities of Göttingen and Berlin. He has written a massive history on the Netherlands by this stage. He will become the US minister in Vienna soon. So again, a well-known individual. Edwin de Leon has been the consul in Alexandria for a few years. And he's a Southerner. So he's kind of like, he's seeing a lot of propaganda for the US coming out, and he's like, I need to respond to that. And kind of boiling it down, when it comes to these letters, it's about explaining it to the British public primarily, because that's really the interested public. And being that it is in the Times of London, it's sort of, it is also designed for the elite, the political decision makers. There's going to be a very different conversation when it goes to the working classes, especially in kind of Lancashire area where you have the cotton mills. But it's sort of, it's about how do we explain what is happening? Is it about independence? Is it about slavery? And I find all three of them use a wonderful argumentative line that sort of has significant repercussions these days, where they say, well, how would Britain feel if Scotland did what the South does? If Scotland declared itself independent, took over arsenals, and tried to establish itself as an international power. With devolution, obviously, that's kind of an interesting play today. But I think in many ways, this is sort of, it's geared towards making it understandable to the British public and playing on, and this is where on both sides, people are really familiar with what has been happening, kind of Britain having emancipated very early on in the kind of 19th century, being kind of the leading figure in this regard, kind of understanding this power play over self-determination. They're all knowing this, and it's sort of like picking the right arguments that fit both the case at home, because they know that it's going to get published at home, but also kind of trying to explain it in words that the British public understands.
Again, so interesting.
Well, you didn't read the letters. They can get rather long.
Well, I imagine thinking about our exhibit that we're going to be opening it in December 2020, so coming up on the immigration, and we're doing a lot of the research in-house, and we're very excited for it to open. But our exhibit features a lot of biographies from men immigrating to the United States after participating in failed European revolutions, especially in about 1848. So that includes individuals from Poland, Ireland, Germany. Aside from forcing these individuals to leave their own countries and come to the United States, how did these revolutions impact the Civil War? It's a heavy question.
Big one. It's a big one. I think, first of all, I would say that we have to sometimes be a bit cautious of why these individuals come, because you do got that tiny group, I would almost call it, that comes for political reasons, because they were leading voices in the revolution, either militarily, politically, and they're being prosecuted. I mean, if you think in terms of Klaus Kossuth in Hungary, I mean, if you stay in Austria, you're going to get executed. It's a death sentence. Not necessarily in the German states, but there's definitely a lot of movement in 1849, 50, 51, 52, depending on when these revolutions fully end. And they're seeking refuge in the United States. Now, some of these political refugees initially are like, I ain't staying. No, my goal is bringing independence to my home country in Europe. I don't care what's happening in the US. So in many cases it takes, and this is sort of the challenge that I had to deal with in my book, Liberty and Slavery, is that they're coming, but they're not yet engaging. They're kind of like, we'll take a year or two, and before you know it's 1855, and they're like, oh yeah, now yeah, it's not going to happen in Europe, so let's get involved in the US. So it's a process. So you do have that political group, but you also have a very substantial, I mean, the vast majority is economic refugees. They're coming to the US. I mean, in the Irish case, the potato famine is decimating the country, and they're looking at a better place to live. You have people from things like places like the Rhineland or the industrial areas of Great Britain who are looking for a possibility to have their own land, their own farm. Some people flee for a religious prosecution reason. So it's this hodgepodge, which really makes it difficult to kind of figure out what do they bring with them? How is this influencing their kind of decision making to come to the United States, and what do they bring? And I think this is a really important question that you're raising, because very often it's sort of this moment where it's like, oh, they're off the boat and they're all this liberty, anti-slavery embracing unionists, and it's like it's not that simple. Neither is it that because you live in Wisconsin or because you live in Iowa or because you live in Louisiana that predetermines which side of the war you're going to fight on. So this is kind of like, it is that intellectual baggage that I think is really important that people bring with them from Europe. So that kind of leads to this question then of, well, what do they see? How does this influence? And there's a wide variety of different ways to look at it. Certainly, individuals who had been on the left side of the political spectrum, kind of, yes, Karl Marx always comes to our mind because the Communist Manifesto gets published in 48, but it's published in 48 weeks before the revolution starts, so he doesn't have that much impact. Yet, there is a very much socialist, communist influenced set of beliefs, members who will be exiled into the United States. So they're looking at what's happening in the Civil War from a more labor perspective, that there's a labor crisis in the southern states where a labor force is enslaved, or where you have northern industry that still is enslaving, in quote unquote, its labor force with wage labor, with wage slavery of sorts. There is the whole issue of kind of like the political, again, left on some levels that wants democracy, wants republicanism, that wants to have people having a say. And that's a difficult group because in Europe, they're biting on concrete because it's like, it's monarchy all the way, and we're not ready yet. I mean, technically speaking, no country in the world really is quite ready to embrace outright democracy as we would think of it. But at the same time, there is sort of, well, we'll go to the United States, and then they discover, oh, well, that democracy ain't really that great when you look at the political machines in the cities, or you look at the southern states and planters dominate the way people vote in southern districts. So there's this other crisis, this other group that looks at the United States and kind of like, oh man, this is terrible. We really need to bring a more pure form of republicanism to the United States. You got the nationalist, and this cuts both ways. This is sort of like where liberty and slavery breaks with a lot of previous scholarship, where it's like, you got this national unification group, say for Italy or for Germany, but you also got this separatist group for like, we want to break away from Austria Habsburg and create Hungary, or we want to break away from the British and create an independent Ireland. So that's really the groups that I found the most difficult to nail down, and they all overlap. There's your nationalist socialist, there's your national, don't take that now the Nazi route, please. Now that I just said that. There is your kind of Republican separatist. I mean, there no one ideology fits everybody. But this is a difficult group, I find, because a lot of the arguments they make are exactly what Southerners would do. But you get to the kind of lead up to the Civil War, and it's sort of like, they're not ending up on the Southern side. Some of them do, like the Irishmen, for example, look at the South and are like, They want national independence. That's what we want. We have the same shared kind of desires. But then I think very often the more political wins out, where it's sort of like you have this moment where there are nationalists, but they're also wanting that Republican system. And they're looking at the South and say, it's an aristocracy. These planters are an aristocracy. We fought aristocrats in Europe who dominated power, who didn't allow us to rise to any position in politics. And those guys in the South are doing the same thing. They're trying to force slavery on us. So it creates this environment where a lot of these revolutionaries look at the South and they're like, this is what we fought against in 1848. And from a political perspective. And therefore, we have to fight it again. We have to continue this struggle. It's sort of this sort of, or is he tech-minded, it's 1848 2.0 that is happening here. And for some of them, I mean, this is sort of going a little beyond your question, there will be 1848 3.0 coming. Be that they go to Mexico and fight with or against Maximiliano, or be that they go back to Europe to bring about something of Hungarian autonomy, an Irish home rule of sorts, or be that German unification. So but it is that difficult baggage that they bring with them, that it's sort of like, how do you translate these experiences? And sometimes you get these head scratchers where it's like, two great examples. There's this Polish guy who was involved in the 1830 revolution. And he eventually settles in Louisiana and becomes a slaveholder, owns a sugar plantation. And you're kind of like, how does, you fought the Russians to overcome kind of the Polish enslavement, and then you go to Louisiana and you enslave people. But for him it was, well, I had a manor. My family owned a manor with serfs, so I wanted a similar manor in Louisiana. And the serf became the slave. The agricultural estate became the plantation. So it's this, it's a head scratch on some level, but on the other hand, it's sort of also that racist, elitist attitudes that sometimes does come along as well. I think the most beautiful one, it's kind of like, that goes to the quintessential problem, is what I opened the book with, and I purposefully picked it because it was so beautiful. It's this Hungarian who fought in 48, and he fights with the U.S. military in the Army of the Potomac, and I think it's late 1863, and he goes out for a reconnaissance ride, figure out where's Lee's army, what can we do? And his buddy gets away, but he gets captured. Unexpectedly, some rebels show up and capture him. And when he's brought to the commanding officer of his captors, the guy is kind of like, so where are you from, dude? It's like, well, Hungary. And the officer's like, why are you fighting for the US? Because from the Southern perspective, and this sort of goes to the larger influence of 1848. From a Southern perspective, they're doing exactly what Hungary had done, exactly what Ireland has done. And now they have a Hungarian in front of them, and it's like, Sod, we're doing what you're doing, but yet you are on the other side of us. He doesn't really give you a good answer of why, but he kind of indicates that he feels this is a larger conflict for the Republican ideal. That and this is sort of assumptive on the part of a lot of these contemporaries. It's sort of like, if the US fails, Republicanism everywhere is gonna fail. Again, this is really assumptive on their part. There's very little evidence that you can bring for this, but that's sort of how they perceive of what they're doing here. That they need to rescue the United States and maintain it as this beacon that European revolutionaries and reformers can look to and point to and say, look, this is really important countries. This is what we should be doing.
I think your answer really speaks to the tapestry that is the Union Army. And there's no blanket answer that answers the question, what motivated this individual or this particular state, whether you were living in Wisconsin, Illinois, wherever in the upper Midwest, what motivated this individual to serve in the Union Army? And then you mix in the whole immigrant aspect of it in the background of some of these individuals. It gets even more muddled when you talk in terms of questions of motivation.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important kind of aspect that we need to consider, because it sort of goes to, I mean, you have or like in the last 2 years, I've seen situations where it's like this officer of the US military who was Mexican has a little incident and gets deported. Or you have a family member of a military officer gets deported. A lot of people see military service in the immigrant community as a way to say, I'm a loyal US citizen.
Yeah.
I belong here. I want to be part of this community. And military service, especially in the Civil War, was for many individuals this kind of way to say, yes, I belong. Of course, you get this other group, especially the Hungarians. That was always the joke that I kind of felt like in the book of, they're just fighters. All they know is military service. And they come to the US where we don't have a standing military. We have a very small volunteer army. And all of a sudden it's like, well, I guess I have to find another career. So the Civil War is almost for them a godsend of like, hey, there's a career here. And after the war, they can write that military career, military contribution to like patronage jobs. So it's like the US government takes care of them afterwards. It's like one of the guys in the book, Alexander Asbos, he is in Missouri. He fights with Fremont in kind of the Springfield campaign. He eventually commands troops in North Florida, who are, a large chunk of them are African American. He gets wounded. He ends up in Argentina as our representative to the country. I think he dies there too, as related to wounds that he suffered in Florida. But it's just the way to show to the country that, hey, I belong here. I want to be good citizen, and I will fight for this country.
It's a fascinating story, and for those folks out there who are looking for more information, aside from your own books, of course, let's not discount your own work. And please let them know again titles and where they can be found, but maybe some other resources, things to consider as they consider these questions of immigrant soldiers arriving in the United States, serving for the Union Army. Can you point some people in directions that you think they should go?
Sure. I know I'll give Jen also a little list that she can maybe post in kind of under the video or somewhere, or maybe scroll it through at this point, whatever works. Well, yeah, there's my own book, Liberty and Slavery, which came out with LSU Press, and that's available on Amazon. But beyond that, I think there's some really good kind of digital resources out there. Damien Shields, who is in Ireland, has a beautiful website where he kind of chronicles where Irish pension recipients live, like individuals who fought in the US military who go back to Ireland and receive a US pension for their service living abroad. So he has a great website in that regard to kind of illustrate that to you, which is it's really fun material. Beyond that, obviously, I'm going to plug myself here as the second time was Age Civil War, which we're doing a lot of great interviews and kind of introducing new books with reviews. The Society of Civil War Historians, and I think one or two of the items we talked about here were from that, actually, the muster blog, where historians kind of write little 1,000-word pieces that are really kind of just give you a little bit of an insight. But I also find the sort of, it's going to be fun. The John Heckman, who does the Tattooed Historian on Facebook, he has done some really interesting stuff. And the other Tattooed Historian, even though he doesn't go by it, Keith Harris, the Rogue Historian podcast, he has done some really nice Civil War stuff too. So if you're having long trips driving, those two may be something to kind of put in the player and kind of play with. The National Park Service too has Reconstruction Era National. Okay, I'm going with Monument, and I know Chris Barr will kill me for it.
Chris Barr was already on too.
Since they have changed names, and I can't for the life of me right now remember which the new title is, but the Reconstruction and the Grand National Historical Park, both of them have done some interviews that are really kind of giving you a good perspective on Civil War history. So there's some good stuff, and I'll give you some book titles for under the video to kind of that are really good stuff too.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. This was really informative, and I think it's such a good gear up for immigration exhibit that we're really excited to open. So this was really a great conversation. I really appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
Bye now.
And thank you to everyone who watched. We will see you soon. Thank you.